"You're not my mama," the boy spat, and threw the plate of biscuits she had carried out to the porch clean off the railing into the dirt, where it broke into 3 ragged pieces among the chickens. "I don't want your cooking. I don't want you here at all." Judith Hale stood very still on the porch of the ranch house near Elk Ridge, the January wind cutting through her shawl, and made herself breathe before she answered. She had been married to Reuben Cutler 11 days. She had known, riding out from the depot in his wagon with her whole life packed into 2 trunks, that his son would not welcome her easily. She had not known it would feel quite this much like being struck. "All right," she said finally, keeping her voice as even as she could manage. "I'll clean it up, Caleb, but I'll make more biscuits tomorrow, whether you eat them or not, because a growing boy needs his breakfast, wanted or unwanted." Caleb Cutler, 8 years old and furious in the particular way only grief can make a child furious, glared at her a moment longer before stalking off toward the barn, and Judith knelt in the cold dirt to gather the broken plate, feeling the chickens curious pecking at her skirt and the January wind at her back. Beneath it all, a loneliness so sharp it nearly buckled her knees. She had married Reuben Cutler for reasons that made sense on paper, a widower with a ranch and a motherless boy, and a woman with no family left of her own after her father's debts had swallowed everything she had once called home. Reuben had written to her through the same matrimonial correspondence that had matched a dozen other women to a dozen other frontier men that year, and his letters had been plain and honest in a way she had come to trust. He needed a mother for his son and a partner for his household, and he would treat her with respect and provide for her fairly, and he made no promises beyond that. She had read those letters over and over in the cramped room she had rented above a dressmaker's shop in a town that no longer felt like home, and had told herself that plain honesty was worth more than pretty promises from a man who might not keep them. The journey west had given her ample time to imagine what waited for her: a tidy house, a companionable silence perhaps, in time, a boy grateful for a woman's steady hand in a motherless kitchen. She had not imagined the particular ache of stepping down from Reuben's wagon that afternoon to find a small, solemn-faced child watching her from the porch with an expression that was not curiosity, not even worriness exactly, but something closer to grief renewing itself at the sight of her. As if her arrival were proof, all over again, that his mother was never coming back. She had smiled at him anyway, had said his name gently, had offered her hand, and he had turned and gone into the house without a word, and Reuben had only sighed and said, "Give him time," in the weary voice of a man who had been saying it to himself for 8 long months and had begun to doubt it. She had come in 11 short days to discover that the boy she was meant to mother regarded her with the flat, wounded hostility of a child who had already lost the one thing he could not bear to lose again. Reuben found her still kneeling in the yard when he came in from the north pasture, and something in his weathered face tightened at the sight of the broken plate in her hands. "He didn't," he said. "He's grieving, Reuben," Judith said, rising and brushing the dirt from her skirt before he could see how badly her hands wanted to shake. "I won't have you scold him on my account. It would only prove to him that I'm a stranger worth resenting harder." "His mother's been gone 8 months," Reuben said, quiet and heavy, watching his son's small, furious back disappear into the barn. "I thought a woman in the house might ease it. I begin to think I've only given him one more thing to be angry at." "Give it time," Judith said, though she did not entirely believe it herself. Not yet, not with the sting of broken porcelain still fresh in her palm. "I didn't come here expecting him to love me by Tuesday." The weeks that followed tested that patience more than she had known any single virtue could be tested. Caleb would not sit near her at meals if he could help it, would not answer when she spoke to him unless his father was in the room to notice the silence, would slip mud onto the floor she had just scrubbed and watch her clean it with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Judith bore it the only way she knew how, steadily, without complaint, the way she had borne her father's debts and her own uncertain future before Reuben's letters had offered her a different one. At church the second Sunday, she felt the town's eyes on her nearly as sharply as Caleb's own. A new bride, a motherless boy who would not sit beside her in the pew, a marriage the whole congregation seemed to be quietly weighing and finding wanting. One woman, meaning to be kind, remarked within Judith's hearing that it was a hard thing to step into a dead woman's kitchen and expect a child to forget her, as if forgetting were the very thing Judith had come west to accomplish. She had held her chin level and said nothing, and ridden home beside Reuben in a silence that felt, for the first time, less like peace and more like two people uncertain how to comfort each other. She mended Caleb's shirts without being asked, taking care over every torn cuff and loosened button, though he never once thanked her for it. She left a plate for him even on the evenings he refused to come to table, and never once mentioned it the next morning when the plate turned up empty regardless, the biscuits gone, though the boy would rather have starved than admit he'd eaten them. When he brought a half-drowned barn kitten to the porch one afternoon, too proud to ask for her help outright, she tended the creature without comment, wrapping it in an old flannel and warming milk on the stove while Caleb hovered nearby pretending not to care, and when the kitten lived, he said only, gruffly, "It would have died anyway if I hadn't found it," and stalked off before she could agree with him. She learned, from the hired hand Dobie, the particular songs Caleb's mother used to sing while she worked the kitchen, and though she never sang them where the boy could hear, she hummed them low while she kneaded bread, and once caught him standing frozen in the doorway, listening, before he turned and fled before she could acknowledge him. Another evening she found, tucked beneath his pillow while she gathered laundry, a small carved horse that Reuben told her later had been his mother's parting gift the Christmas before she died, and Judith said nothing of finding it, only folded his blanket more carefully than she needed to and left the room exactly as she had found it, understanding that some griefs were not hers to touch, only to leave room for. "He tested his last governess the same way before you," Reuben admitted one such evening, watching his son's door close a little too hard down the hall. "She lasted 6 weeks and left in tears, said the boy was unmanageable. I begin to wonder if I've asked more of you than any woman ought to bear for a stranger's wages." "I'm not being paid to manage him, Reuben," Judith said. "I'm married into a family. I don't intend to be run off by a boy's grief, however sharp its teeth." It was Reuben who told her. One evening on the porch after Caleb had gone to bed, still refusing to bid either of them good night, that his wife had died of a fever that took only 3 days to run its course, so fast that the boy had barely understood she was truly gone until the funeral was already over. "He keeps waiting for her to come back," Reuben said. "I think some part of him believes if he lets himself care for you, it means admitting she isn't. That's a hard thing to ask an 8-year-old to reckon with, and I don't know how to help him do it." "You don't have to know," Judith said. "I don't expect either of us has to solve his grief on any particular schedule. I only mean to keep showing up, plate after plate, until he decides for himself that I'm not going anywhere." But even her patience had a limit, and it was tested hardest on an evening in early spring when Caleb, having slipped away from his chores to go fishing at the creek against his father's strict instruction, did not come home by supper, and did not come home by dark. Reuben was saddling his horse within minutes of realizing the boy was missing, his face gone pale and grim in the lantern light, and Judith, without asking permission, saddled the old mare herself and rode out beside him into the dark, refusing his order to stay at the house and wait. "He'll need more than one rider searching that creek bank in the dark," she said when Reuben his mouth to argue, "and he'll need someone who isn't so frightened her hands shake when we find him that she can't tend a scared wet boy proper. I can do that. Let me." The dark came down fast and full over the creek bottoms, and the two of them called Caleb's name into a wind that seemed determined to carry the sound anywhere but toward him, splitting up along the bank where the water ran fastest, Reuben taking the near side and Judith the far, her lantern swinging wild shadows across the cottonwoods and the black, rushing water. She thought more than once in that long hour of every terrible possibility, a mother, a real one, or one still only learning to be one, imagines when a child does not answer a called name, and found that the fear crowding her chest was not the polite worry of a woman minding another woman's son out of duty, but something fiercer and more entirely her own. She called his name until her voice went hoarse, and did not stop, and somewhere in the calling she understood that she had long since stopped thinking of Caleb as a task to be managed and started thinking of him, plainly and without permission, as hers to fear losing. They found him an hour later, huddled in the hollow of a fallen cottonwood near the creek, soaked through and shivering violently, his ankle swollen from a fall on the slick rocks that had left him unable to walk the mile home. He had been crying, Judith could see even in the lantern light, though he tried to scrub the evidence from his face the moment he saw them. "I didn't mean to fall," he said, his teeth chattering so hard the words came out broken. "I was only going to fish a little while. I didn't mean to be gone so long." "Nobody's angry, Caleb," Judith said, sliding from the mare before Reuben had even reached the ground, and she was at the boy's side wrapping her own shawl around his shaking shoulders before either male had finished processing the scene. "You're freezing. Let's get you warm first and worry about the rest after." She carried him, small and shivering and far lighter than she had expected, back to where Reuben waited the horses, and something in the way, Caleb's cold fingers curled instinctively into the front of her dress on the ride home. Not resisting her arms around him, not pulling away, settled deep in her chest like the first warm coal of a fire that had been a long time catching. Back at the ranch house, she stripped his wet clothes and wrapped him in blankets before the kitchen stove, and bound his swollen ankle with a poultice of the kind her own mother had taught her years before, murmuring softly the whole while, not the words to any particular song, only steady, low reassurance, the sound of a voice determined to stay however long it was needed. Caleb, exhausted and finally warm, watched her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not hostility, not the flat wariness of the past months, but something rawer and more uncertain, the look of a child deciding, against every instinct grief had taught him, whether it might be safe to want something again. "My mama used to hum while she cooked," he said finally, so quietly she nearly missed it over the crackle of the stove. "You hum too. I heard you in the kitchen. I pretended I didn't." "I know," Judith said gently. "I saw you in the doorway." "I didn't want to like it," Caleb admitted, his voice cracking now with something that was not entirely about his ankle. "I thought if I liked anything about you, it would mean I was forgetting her. Tonight, when I fell and I was so cold, and I didn't think anybody was coming, I wished it was you I heard calling my name. Not just Pa, you too." Judith felt her own eyes sting fiercely and did not try to hide it from him. "Caleb," she said, "loving someone new was never going to take 1 inch of your mother away from you. I promise you that, as plain and true as I know how to say it. I'm not here to replace her. I couldn't if I tried, and I wouldn't want to. I'm only here to be one more person in this house who'd walk into the dark after you every single time, for as long as you'll have me." Caleb was quiet a long moment, his small hand finding hers where it rested on the edge of his blanket and closed around it, tentative and small and entirely without hostility for the first time since she had arrived. "Will you stay?" he asked, "even after my ankle's better? Even if I'm not always, even if I don't always say it right that I want you to?" "I was never planning to leave," Judith said, her voice thick. "Not for a broken plate, not for a cold shoulder, not for anything short of you telling me plain that you truly wanted me gone. And I don't believe tonight that you want that at all." "I don't," Caleb said, and for the first time in months the words came without a single trace of spite in them. "I want you to stay, please." Reuben, standing in the kitchen doorway where he had watched the whole exchange without daring to interrupt it, crossed the room now and knelt beside them both, his hand coming to rest over Judith's shoulder with a tenderness that had been building, unspoken, through every hard week that had led them here. "We both do," he said quietly. "I should have said it plainer weeks ago. I married you thinking only of what my son needed. I've come to know, watching you these past months, exactly what I need too." Judith looked between the two of them, the boy's small hand still holding hers, the father's steady one now resting warm against her shoulder, and felt the loneliness that had followed her west, through every broken plate and silent supper, finally fully ease. By summer, Caleb had taken to riding out with Reuben and Judith both on the Sunday rounds of the herd, chattering easily beside her the way he had once refused to sit near her at all, asking her opinion on which colt would make the steadiest cow pony, and whether she thought his mother would have liked the wild flowers he'd taken to picking for the kitchen table. He asked such questions plainly now, without flinching, the way a boy asks who has finally learned that loving one woman does not require unloving another, and Judith answered every one of them honestly, glad, each time, to be trusted with the asking. The same woman from church who had once wondered aloud whether Judith could ever truly replace what Caleb had lost found herself, that autumn, remarking instead on how settled the boy seemed, how he'd taken to trailing his stepmother through the kitchen garden of a Saturday morning. Chattering about nothing in particular, easy as breathing. Judith only smiled at the remark and let it pass without correction, since she had long since stopped needing the town's good opinion to know the truth of what her own house had become, the ranch near Elk Ridge, which had held its grief close and quiet for the better part of a year before she arrived, filled instead with the ordinary, precious noise of a family that had, against every hard beginning, finally found its way whole, supper conversations that ran long past the dishes. A boy's laughter carrying from the barn where it had once carried only silence, and a marriage that had begun as a plain arrangement of need and groan, patiently plate by mended plate, into something neither Reuben nor Judith had dared name aloud until it was already fully theirs. Judith never did learn the tune to the songs Caleb's mother used to sing, not exactly, not word for word. But she hummed her own instead, in the kitchen every morning after, and never again had to wonder whether anyone in that house was listening, or whether, at long last, they were glad that she had stayed.